And it's very hard, especially in the current state of the world, to renounce treaties. And the second reason it's unlikely to be renounced is because Egypt got what it wanted. Israel was forced to withdraw from every last inch of Egyptian territory. It's true there were some conditions made in the case of the Sinai, not particularly important, but even there was this tiny, tiny little triangle called Taba, which the Israelis wanted because they had built a resort there. And the Egyptians said, you don't return Taba. It's the end of the Camp David agreement. And they fought about it, believe it or not, right through the 1980s. It finally went into international arbitration, and the Egyptians won the international arbitration. But they got everything they wanted from that Camp David agreement, and they got a peace treaty, but it came at the price of a peace treaty, but the Egyptians never wanted war with Israel in the first place. So for them, I'm referring all the way back to 1952. So for them, it was no real loss. Well, that brings us then finally to the obvious question. If it's not fear of Egyptian aggression, and if it's not fear that Egypt will renounce the peace treaty, what is it that Israel fears? And it's clear that they are panicky now. That much is true. And here I think it's useful because Israel is a relatively young state. You know, for some people in this room it's a young entity, but for others it's a relatively young state. And there's a certain continuity of thinking. You know, Shimon Peres, the current president, was one of the favorites of the founding father, Ben-Gurion. So the thinking is pretty, there's a continuity in the thinking. And already right after the 1948 war, when Israel became an independent state, already the biggest fear of the Israelis was that the Arab world might bring forth a leader like Ataturk in Turkey, who would achieve real independence for his country and transform parts of the Arab world into modernized states. After the 1956 Israeli attack on Egypt, Ben-Gurion, the prime minister at the time, and now I'm quoting him, this is what he said: I always fear that a personality might arise, such as arose among the Arab rulers in the 7th century. Someone like Kemal Ataturk, who arose in Turkey after his defeat in the First World War. He raised the spirits of the people. He changed their character. He turned the people into a fighting nation. There was and still is a danger that Nasser is this man. They feared at the time that Nasser might play this role of a modernizing leader like Ataturk. Well, it wasn't the fear of an Egyptian aggression against it, and there isn't that fear now because all the regional states recognize attacking Israel would be suicidal, militarily suicidal. That's not the fear. The fear is that the Egyptian revolution will enable it to modernize, will enable it to become a power to reckon with in the region, to become something like Turkey and Iran, a power that can no longer be pushed around. I was very struck in a good article by a fellow named Paul Amar. He was describing El-Baradei, and he, the former head of the IAEA, who plays a role now in Egypt. And he said one thing about El-Baradei: okay, he's not a radical, he's not Lenin, for better or for worse, depending on your sensibility. But he said El-Baradei, he's the type, he's not a pushover. You can't push him around. And that's what the Israelis fear, that they'll no longer be able to push around Egypt, that Egypt will become like Turkey has now become, a power that demands its place under the sun, a power that demands a regional role that's commensurate with its political weight. And I'm gonna finish up now, and that's for Israel the biggest fear, that alongside Iran and Turkey, an independent Egypt would mean the nightmare scenario for Israel. And that nightmare scenario is that it would lose its war option, the basic tenet of Israeli strategic thinking is Arabs only understand the language of force. And every once in a while, you have to take out that big club and break their skulls to remind them who's in charge in the region. But now with all the regional powers potentially arrayed against it, Turkey, Iran, Egypt, and potentially these countries no longer languishing in economic and intellectual backwardness, with the U.S. losing its grip over the region, Israel now faces a dreadful prospect. And the prospect is that it will have to negotiate with the Arab states as equals and not be able to lord it over them. And that's the prospect that Israel fears, and that's the real threat posed by the Egyptian revolution.
I think the word that Norman just used, equals, is a very important word. This is